and welcome to Miracles from the Hill podcast, where we share raw stories that display the anatomy of God's grace here at Miracle Hill Ministries. If this is your first time joining us, please subscribe, and of course, you can like, comment, and leave a review. To connect with us, visit our website linked in the description box. And now, here is our host, Ryan Dirk.
Greetings, listeners, and welcome to episode 1 of our newest season, season 4 of the Miracles from the Hill podcast. If you have been here before, welcome back. If you're new, thanks for joining us. So this season, we are diving deep into the reality, the ideas, the struggle of addiction and addiction recovery. We want to explore its solutions, and we'll explain why this is a subject that is important to us. If you've been listening to the podcast for a long time, you'll notice that many of the stories that we talk about have addiction as part of a person's reality that they come through. So if you'd like to hear more about the podcast, pause the episode right now, leave a review on whatever platform you're listening to. You can also follow the show to make sure you're one of the first to listen to new content when it comes out every 2 weeks. What day does it drop on, Katie? Drops on Wednesdays every 2 weeks. You can count on a new episode. If you have questions you'd like to see addressed on an episode, or if you have a thought or some way that you can help us to be better, email us at podcast@miraclehill.org. And on this episode, we are excited to have my brother, Brad Holland, joining us. Good day, Brad. How are you?
Good morning. Doing well.
Good. So Brad is the director of our men's Christ-centered discipleship program, helping men with life-dominating issues known as Overcomers. Brad has been on staff here at Miracle Hill almost the exact same amount of time that I have, right?
Yep.
So how many years is that? 16? Almost 16?
Getting towards 16.
Getting towards 16. And so Brad and I are going to be spending the episode dialoguing about what is kind of the purpose, or what is the definition of addiction, and what is addiction recovery, and what's the purpose behind recovery, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Really light content.
Yeah.
Today.
Let's go deep.
Let's go deep. Okay. Well, first off, the people want to know about you, Brad. When did you meet Jesus?
I was extremely fortunate and grew up in a loving Christian home. So I remember praying a prayer of salvation in the top bunk of my bedroom, my twin brother below me, and my dad leading the prayer when I was 5 years old.
What, and was your twin brother in on it?
No, he didn't get saved till later, so
okay.
I was born again first.
You were born again first. Were you born first?
No, I was born second.
You were born second, born again first.
That's right.
Oh man, there's a T-shirt in there somewhere. Okay, so you had a pretty normal upbringing. What was life like, and how in the world did the Lord use your life to bring you to Miracle Hill?
I think overall pretty normal life. Went to church, went to a Christian school. Miracle Hill was a household name. Reed Lehman, previous CEO, and my dad served on the same deacon board, and so really heard a lot about Miracle Hill, but really had no clue what they did until that 16 years ago when I came back to this area in 2008, and nobody was hiring anybody. Recession was in full swing. But fortunately, there was a position in Spartanburg that I was able to get.
Okay. And so did you feel like called to the ministry at that point? I think that you would say that you're called to the ministry now, or were you just looking for a job?
No, Christ had radically changed the direction of my life. So I was in restaurant business for years and knew that Jesus was true, knew that the gospel was true, but could not figure out how to make it work, which was part of the problem. And it wasn't until I finally kind of gave that over and said, I can't do this, Jesus, so I'm just going to start talking to you. And it began with simple prayer and ended up on a short-term missions trip, ended back up in school, got a degree in Bible, knew that direction of my life was changing, and then Miracle Hill just was a great fit to the puzzle.
I don't think I knew you had a undergrad in Bible. Wow. After the restaurant world.
Yep.
So stark difference.
Yep. It was a great time. I had had enough technical school credits that I literally majored in Bible, but all the other credits were done.
So you really just majored on, you just focused on that.
Yep. It was awesome.
Good. So Brad, you're one of the more well-rounded staff members at Miracle Hill. Briefly talk through kind of your employment journey. What all have you done?
So got to start out in Spartanburg as a case manager, and really helped out a lot in the kitchen, helped kind of lead some of the intern program back then, our ministry training program now, and then became a program manager in Spartanburg, and felt God calling to something different. I had previous experience with children in North Carolina in a psychiatric setting, so I ended up moving to our children's division as an intake coordinator and worked with our Homes for Life program, our boys shelter. And then a position opened up with the children's home as a director. And so applied for that and was hired to direct the children's home and did that for 5-6 years. And then the government put me out of business. So we transitioned our children's home into foster homes. And Miracle Hill graciously found a spot for me in our Miracle Hill Enterprises. And so I got to lead a group of wonderful people in a couple of for-profit ventures that kind of feed into the ministry side with Creation Works, our landscaping company, and Bridge Works, our staffing company. And did that for not quite 2 years, and then Overcomers Director opened up. And been loving doing that for about the last 20 months.
What do you love about it?
I love being able to see guys grow and just having a small part of that. As director, you know, a lot of my job is some numbers and processes and things like that, and making sure staff are shepherded and cared for well. But occasionally I get to speak into men's life, but I do get to sit back and just watch them grow over time. And the other side of that coin is how much Christ has done in my life, worked on me, continues to work on me by helping other people grow.
You know, as you know, our listeners may or may not know, I had that job for a season of life. And the thing that drove me the craziest in that job is the thing that I missed the most about that job. It's sitting in your office, the same place my office was, and you get that knock on the door, and you're busy. So you don't have time to handle whatever that knock is, but you open the door, and there's some guy there, and he's got some question about life. Some like life-altering question. You know, why did God let my wife die? Why does my family hate me? Why, you know, the why questions. And there's no easy way to answer those questions except to, you know, wade into them and sit there for 20, 30, 40 minutes, an hour talking about it and completely get you off what you're trying to do. But man, that is the best part. That is the ministry. That is where life change happens. Yeah, that's good stuff.
Yep.
So I'm jealous of you from that regard. Okay, so why in the world would we do a season specifically on addiction? Well, if you have to boil down Miracle Hill and what we do two things. We are here to serve those experiencing homelessness, specifically to tell them about Jesus. Right? Like that's the kind of sum total of who Miracle Hill is. And the reality is that addiction is a huge piece of the puzzle with the population of people experiencing homelessness. So I looked up numbers before we had this episode. These are national numbers that of those experiencing homelessness, 50% have an addiction issue. 52% are considered severely mentally ill. Then there is the comorbidity of that, right? The people who are addicted and have a mental health issue. And then the $1 million question, is that real or is there addiction that's creating or mimicking mental health, or mental health that is creating addiction issues? And if we had all of the Miracle Hill directors here in the room today, and we asked them what their percentages were of addiction and mental health, I think they would say, you can please disagree with me on this, I think they would say that the addiction number is probably somewhere around 50, 60%. They would say that the mental health number percentage is much higher than 50%. Some facilities would say 75% of the population. And so all day, every day at Miracle Hill, our staff are walking with individuals who are walking through the issue of addiction. Certainly true in my life. As we've now gone through 3 seasons of the Miracles from the Hill podcast, I'm going to say that of the stories we've told, people stories, I'm going to say 80% had addiction. Maybe 90% had addiction as part of their story. It's a huge issue. And it's one that we walk through each and every day. And so we, in the ministry, and certainly our listeners, know people who are struggling with this issue. So we need to know what we believe about it and what we believe God is calling us to do to help combat it. So this first episode today is really just about asking the big questions, right? Kind of unpacking what it is and what we're trying to do with it. And then the following episodes, I don't even know that you know this, the following episodes, we're doing 12 episodes. And each episode will be focused on one of the 12 steps and the tasks kind of found within those 12 steps, and then stories from each one of those. So for those that are joining us for the duration, we have some amazing people that are coming on this podcast. All kinds of Miracle Hill staff members, people from the community that are addiction recovery specialists and professionals. And then we've got some patriarchs, Miracle Hill patriarchs coming on. I got Reverend Ken Kelly coming on for an episode. I got, and he was a staff member for 25 years and then ran another ministry. I got Curtis Pitts coming on, who was the director when I went through Overcomers a million years ago. It's going to be awesome. And we're going to learn a lot. So me and you have the pleasure of trying to help people understand exactly what this is. Let me say one more thing then before we get into the questions to you, Brad. So if Miracle Hill's purpose is to help those experiencing homelessness and to tell them about Jesus, then why do we have Overcomers and Renewal? Well, Overcomers and Renewal are designed to help those experiencing homelessness who have addiction issues. I think that when you look at Miracle Hill from the outside, people often think that these are kind of separate ministries, but they're not. They all exist to serve the greater mission, which is helping those experiencing homelessness. So, Brad, you ready?
Let's do it.
All right. What is addiction?
What is addiction? So I think most people would kind of take a fairly simple, it's something that I do that I can't stop doing. But it really goes a little bit deeper into it's whether it's a substance or exercise, alcohol, smoking or something like that. But it's a habit that I've started to form for whatever reason, and we'll talk more about that, but that it begins to control us and our actions and our need to continue to do that habit rather than us being able to control it.
Okay. So let's there's a couple different words here, right? So we've got addiction, we've got dependence, we've got habit. Are those on a spectrum? Is there a difference between those ideas?
There is, and I think really the word control helps us understand it a little bit better. So I can have a habit, whether it's, rubbing my goatee, and it's subconscious, doesn't hurt anything. Can I stop doing it? Yeah, that habit forming thing within 30 days, if I do something different for 30 days, I can form a new habit. When it comes to dependence, dependence on something isn't necessarily bad in and of itself. Medications might be a good example of that. Somebody who is in constant pain may have a dependence of sorts on a need for medication. Mental health may be a great example of that. But it is something that is met with a professional, somebody that guides the person into using something correctly and having that dependence. And addiction really takes that next step in loss of control. So instead of using a medication correctly as the doctor prescribes it, I begin to use it and try to get extra prescriptions or use multiple things at the same time or using it in a way that's not intended.
So I think that control idea is interesting. So I'm going to generalize what you just said, and then you tell me if it's right or wrong. So addiction is something that I need that controls me. Dependence is something that I'm choosing to need that I control. Is that fair?
I think that's a fair generalization, yeah.
Okay.
One of the other things that oftentimes we're challenged with when somebody comes into one of our facilities and says, I'm not an addiction. I can stop at any point. One way to challenge that, and an obvious one, is, well, why are you here? What has caused you to lose your place to live? What has caused you to lose your job, your family, all of the resources in life? And generally, addiction is behind it. And so challenging that, well, you don't have control of this because no rational person would sacrifice all these things just for a substance.
And so what you're describing is one of the main first steps on the road to recovery, which is overcoming denial, which we'll have a whole episode on overcoming denial. But denial is not seeing the reality of your situation for what it is, right? Okay, so somebody who is stuck in an addiction cycle of whatever sort, what is going on in their body, in their mind, and in their spirit? And we'll take them whatever order you want to take those in.
Well, I think there's a common thread to some of those things. And, it depends on some of the roots to the addiction. But oftentimes it really has this idea of self-medicating. So it may start off, like we mentioned before, like a true medical condition that we need medication for. And suddenly we find that it makes us feel good in a way that, this really helps not just deal with pain, but soothe some sort of trauma or mental pain or whatever it may be. Ultimately, if as somebody's not a Christian, they're maybe trying to fill a God-sized hole. But spiritually, mentally, and physically, oftentimes it's that idea of self-medicating to either feel nothing or feel something good.
Okay. So physically, I think it's helpful to point out that some substances have a dependent, and we're mixing words here, a dependency creating aspect to the substance itself, where your body physically becomes dependent on the drug or the substance, while other addictions, we'll say pornography, can become psychologically addicting. But the root in both of those physically is the release of chemicals in your brain. So running, let's use running, pornography, and heroin, okay, to describe it. So people can become psychologically addicted to running or exercise, but they are also getting a high it's a joke, right? It's an ongoing joke that if you take a long run, you get, a runner's high at the end of it. But that's physically, there is something happening there where they're getting a release of chemicals into their body. Pornography, same deal, right? There is something psychologically pulling you to the act of looking at pornography, and maybe masturbation or whatever that goes along with that. But then there's also a chemical dump when the object is completed, or you've looked at what you are felt pulled to look at. With heroin, same deal. You get psychologically addicted to using it, but you're also using a substance to create a chemical reaction in your body. Then your body then becomes dependent and builds up a tolerance to it. So all kind of the same action with the same outcome. The difference is some substances do create that physical dependence to the substance. Also interesting to note, of all the substances we read about in the news, right, or our listeners read about in the news, whether it's heroin or fentanyl or fill in the blank, many of them create a physical dependence. Not many of them, just a few. Just a few create a physical dependence. More often than not, there's a psychological dependence, like marijuana, right? Like there's no physically dependent part of that. There's only one that can kill you from withdrawal, and that's benzodiazepines, which is your Xanax, your Valium, one of the most commonly prescribed anxiety medications in America. You can die if you become physically addicted to it. But some of the other big ones, like heroin, you're not going to die. You're just going to be miserable when you try to come off of it, because you have a physical withdrawal side to deal with. Okay, what's going on in somebody's? I've mentioned the word psychologically addicted several times. What's going on in somebody's mind and in their spirit?
The mind piece, I can relate to my own life. Working in the restaurant business, I picked up the habit of smoking, and the physical addiction to nicotine, 7 to 10 days, all the nicotine's out of your system. But it took years for me in certain places and certain stresses to not get that itch to want to grab a cigarette. And so that mind piece, anytime I need to relax, then let's have a cigarette. After I finish eating, well, let's have a cigarette. On the golf course, let's have several cigarettes. And it took a long time before that mental piece, that need to relax or work, if I have a stressful moment, whatever that might be, that thing to quit popping in my mind over and over again.
Yeah, so in our brains, everything that we do creates a map in your brain, a neurological bridge, and addiction builds really big bridges. And so even when you remove the object, in that case cigarettes, in other cases other substances, the bridge still exists. So when you do something, it reminds you to do something else, and you don't burn those bridges down easily. Right? Like some of those bridges take a long time. You got to build a whole nother bridge over the top that says, hey, instead of smoking when I play golf, now I chew gum or whatever you do. Right. You got to build a different bridge. So there is also a chemical, neurological component to this that creates these roadmaps in your brain pointing you to do this thing that's trying to kill you over and over and over again. What about somebody's spirit?
Spiritually, as we are all born sinners, we are searching for something to fill our need for a Savior, that relationship with God. And we're created with Imago Dei, that image of God imprinted on us, and we're created in certain ways for certain things. And when those things are not met, we're going to try to fill them with whatever we can at hand. Ultimately, that leads to really many forms of idolatry in our life. And so for the addict, or for the addiction piece, we are now substituting what God should be doing in our hearts and lives with a substance to make us feel good. And that becomes the controlling piece to our life. And we're trying to replace God.
So I think it's really important that you point to this idea of idolatry. And also, before we take another step forward in the conversation, we try to level the playing field. So if you look up the top addictions in America, the usual suspects are on that list, right? Mm-hmm. Heroin, fentanyl, alcohol, et cetera, et cetera. But other things that are on that list that, hear me, audience, coffee is probably the number one addiction in America. Make no mistake, when you don't drink your coffee in the morning and you get a headache, that is physical withdrawal you are having from not having the caffeine that you're used to having in the morning. When you are drawn to that coffee every single morning, you have created a chemical neurological bridge in your brain that tells you that you have to have coffee. Mm-hmm. Then you've added a substance, caffeine in this case, to reinforce that and create a chemical dependence on a substance. That's a very real thing. And you know, per the GDP, we spend more money on coffee as a people than just about anything else that's an addictive substance. Another thing that is on the list that if you don't drink coffee, I'll probably get you on this one, is your phone, right? Technology has become a huge addiction problem. If you don't believe me and you don't think you're addicted, leave your phone at home tomorrow and see how your day goes. I bet that there is not 1 out of 10 people listening to this that is brave enough to attempt leaving their phone at home. They probably have so much fear in their brain about that idea. Guys, you're addicted.
Well, the first thing you have to do is send out an email letting people know that you don't have your phone.
Yeah. And then you still be panicking all day. I mean, and I'm guilty, right? Like I'm not pointing my finger. If I leave my house and I get 10 minutes away and I realize I don't have my phone, which never happens, but let's say it did happen, I would not be able to function. I would turn around, I would come back, and I would get that phone. And I would justify it, right? Like classic addiction. I would justify it, I would rationalize it, how I have to have that thing when it's just a thing, right? It's really just a thing. Now I'm going to say, well, it's a tool, and I have to have it. I communicate with people. But we have become dependent, habituated, and dare I say, addicted to our phones. If you don't believe me, try to leave it at home tomorrow. See how good you do. Please report back at podcast@miraclehill.org with your experience. I'd love to hear it. Okay, so in your experience, looking at the thousands of people that you've interacted with at Miracle Hill over the years, what do you see as some of the leading causes of addiction?
I think probably the biggest one that I see over and over is some form of trauma that's happened. You know, oftentimes, I said I worked with children before Miracle Hill, and it was a really good experience in that learning about how to help people begin that healing process. And as children, there's so much resilience with children when they can get help early on and deal with that. They have much healthier lives. Unfortunately, many of our people that we encounter in our programs have some sort of childhood trauma. I've heard some horrific stories, and it's gone undealt with. And as they grow up, there's a pain, and they need to figure out how to quiet that pain. So I would say trauma is one of the big ones. We see it in our military vets, right? They go to war, they see stuff, experience stuff, and come back, and this trauma causes PTSD. You mentioned it before, and I would say that PTSD is a good lead-in. Mental health, it is a tough one. I have seen many people use substances trying to self-medicate mental health, whether it's depression, they feel down, so they need something to feel better, feel up. sometimes with things like schizophrenia, literally to quiet the voices in their head. And so we see such prevalence with mental health.
So correlation does not mean causation, but let's talk about some correlations for a minute. So you can find tons of research on the correlation between the prevalence of addiction and ACE scores, which is adverse childhood experiences, which is a test that you can give people to determine how much trauma they experienced as a kid. And so the correlation would be the higher the ACE score, the higher the prevalence of addiction. Certainly PTSD would just be another form of trauma. I completely agree with you. And so this has resulted, like these different ideas about the causes of addiction has resulted in tons and tons of models of what causes addiction, and then different kind of angles on recovery, because depending on what you think causing it would mean that you would treat it differently. So let's kind of walk through those just a little bit. And I think we've actually talked about this on another podcast episode, but it's worth repeating. So for a millennia, the leading model was called the moral model. I don't think it was called that, but it was the model. And it was basically the idea that people who were addicted had poor character and they could not be corrected because of their sin nature. This was a model that was perpetrated by the church. I'm using the word perpetrate on purpose, to basically mean that people who were addicts were just unrepentant, unfixable sinners with poor moral character. And that was kind of the driver for literally 1,000 years. Then in the beginning of the 20th century, you have this idea that comes out that gets referred to as the disease model. The disease model basically says that addicts have a disease that cannot be cured. It can only be treated. And the treatment is kind of these different tasks within a recovery kind of framework. And from that pops out these 12 steps, right? Dr. Bob and Bill W. create this framework that's referred to as AA. It's also important to note when I say that the 12 steps were built out of the ideas found in the Bible. Then Jesus was snatched out of the 12 steps to make it more palatable for the general public, for people who are not believers. And so we at Miracle Hill, who use a biblical 12-step model, we just put Jesus back into his rightful place. And we'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, so then at the latter half of the 20th century, you have this kind of scientific revolution, and all these models, because the ability to find science improves. You have all these models that come up. You have a genetic predisposition model. Essentially, that comes up because now we have the ability to see genes, right? And so we're thinking about humans from the perspective of where they come from genetically. And so genetic predisposition would say it's in your genes that makes you an addict. Then you have a model of learned behavior that would say that which is kind of tied to a family of origin model, which would say that where you come from and the people you were around taught you how to behave in some way, shape, or form. Then you have kind of the more purely psychological model, which would say that we have addictive personality. I think it was called addictive personality disorder in the DSM-4. I don't know what it's called in the DSM-5. Probably the same thing. But it would say that the way your brain's wired leads you to addictive behaviors. And we could sit here for the next 20 minutes and unpack different models, right? Like there's all these different models that point to a different aspect of what causes the issue. Brad, what model does Miracle Hill use?
So we use a eclectic approach, right? So we pull a little bit from each of these, but we undergird all of that with Christ, Scripture, and but all truth is God's truth. It's kind of a Christianese saying, but there are pieces to all of that depending on the person that we are counseling and their needs at the moment. We can pull different resources from different places.
So it depends on the person's story.
Yeah,
it depends on their history, their life, and what makes them them. And then it would, from a recovery perspective, be their responsibility in relationship, ideally with God, to look at each area of their life and determine the contributing factors, whether it's trauma or personality or mental health or fill in the blank, whatever the case may be. And it could be one or it could be all, right? There could be contributors from all different areas. Okay, so why don't you just briefly talk about kind of the philosophy of recovery Miracle Hill uses? Like, how do we go about recovery?
So, overcomers and renewal for our ladies' counterpart, we use the 12-step model that you mentioned before, and it really does a good job providing a process, a system of thinking. So it's kind of that cognitive behavioral therapy kind of idea that, as we learn about ourselves, we learn about God, we learn about ourselves, and we go through these steps that we can find freedom from old habits and controls and the things that we've talked about, dependence. But that 12 steps doesn't cure anything in and of itself, but it gives a process to help somebody have some clear thinking.
So let's jump back on I don't want to go past the CBT comment. So cognitive behavioral therapy, and please, psychologists who listen to this, you can correct my rudimentary understanding. So essentially CBT would say that people have false beliefs about the world that lead to negative behaviors as a result of those false beliefs. So CBT, or a program designed on CBT, is designed to help people think about the world and themselves from a healthier standpoint, to develop healthier behaviors to interact with that new understanding of what the world is. And so the 12 steps are a tool kind of in that environment that, let's break them down real quickly. So the first 3 steps really have to do with our understanding and relationship with God, the God of our understanding, in our case, Jesus, right? The next few steps have to do with our relationship with ourselves, meaning understanding our own past, present, and future, and our relationship with others. Okay, so that's 4 through 9, steps 4 through 9. Then step 10, its only purpose is to remind you to keep the house cleaned out, meaning steps 4 through 9, every day.
Right.
Step 11 would say, hey, you need to make sure you're maintaining your relationship with God, steps 1, 2, and 3, every day. And then step 12 would say, hey, if this is all true, then you need to tell people about it, which from a Christian perspective would be evangelism, right?
Making disciples.
Yeah. So we're using this kind of model, this systematic model, to help walk people through figuring out their relationship with God, figuring out who they are, their identity in the world, and then figuring out if those two things are true, how then do I relate to people and work on the relationships that I already have, and do that every day to keep my life clean.
Yeah.
Fair?
I'll add, and I probably will make some people mad that maybe really believe in the cognitive behavioral therapy model, But without Christ, that cognitive behavioral therapy model really, I think all we do is trade our habits out. We create new systems of thinking, but without Christ, we don't have that truth, that true reality to be able to find healing.
Yeah, and my Bible teaches me to think on very specific things, right? What is right, what is honorable, what is, all that stuff. My Bible tells me that, when I'm in Christ, I'm a new creation. The old is gone. What's the old? My old way of thinking, my old way of living. The new has come. My Bible teaches me to give my body up as a sacrifice, right? Holy and pleasing, and the Lord will clean out all the rest of that stuff. So the 12 steps or a cognitive behavioral therapy framework are just maybe secular ways of saying we're trying to do what the Bible tells us to do. Fair?
Yep.
Okay, does somebody have to be a Christian to be at Miracle Hill or to be at Overcomers?
No, absolutely not. We want to welcome everybody, anybody that we can. We want to have the ability to share the gospel. If we expect everybody to be found before we see them, we would lose so much of our ministry to be able to serve people. And so, short answer, come as you are.
Come as you are. You don't have to be a Christian. You're just going to hear a lot about Jesus while you're there.
That's it.
You figure out what to do with it while you're there. Okay, so if somebody checks into Overcomers, into this Christ-centered discipleship program, aka Christian recovery program, what then would be the goals for their life? Like, what are you trying to accomplish? What are you trying to help someone accomplish in their own life as they walk through Overcomers?
So I think the 12 steps helps really outline it. You mentioned it before, and so initially, early on, it's really trying to learn about who they are in relationship to God. Doing a moral inventory is a huge part of the 12 steps, and diving into our past, who we are,